I shouldn't be here, he said, though his hand was already on the doorknob. You already are, she replied, her voice a low warning, like the crack of thunder before a storm. The cafe was nearly empty, dim but not dark, a place that felt hidden even though it sat on a well-lit street in the city's older quarter. Rain streaked the windows. The clock above the counter hummed softly. When he finally stepped inside, the bell chimed and her eyes, sharp, gray, unflinching, lifted from the notebook she was pretending to read. He was 23, maybe 24, though she'd already decided he looked too young for whatever he thought he wanted. His jacket was still wet from the rain, his hair clinging to his forehead, his expression a mix of nerves and hunger. Emotional, not physical, though it would become both. You're late, she said, closing the notebook. I didn't think you'd actually show up, he said. Her lips twitched. And yet here we both are. Mini-climax number 1, awkward tension. He sat across from her, unsure what to do with his hands. She watched him the way a painter studies an empty canvas, half disdain, half fascination. Their first meeting hadn't been romantic. He'd spilled coffee on her shoes at a bookstore 2 weeks earlier, then somehow made her laugh about it. She hadn't laughed like that in years. When he'd found her again on social media and asked her to meet, just to apologize properly, she'd surprised herself by saying yes. You know how this looks? She asked. He smirked nervously, like a young idiot chasing a midlife crisis. She almost choked on her tea. Bold. And wrong. I'm not having a crisis. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming. Then what are you having? She didn't answer. The silence was alive, charged, dangerous. Mini-climax number 2, first spark. The conversation stumbled, then ignited. He was studying literature at a local university. She was an art curator, divorced, her teenage son living with her ex in another city. When she spoke about art, her voice softened. When he spoke about books, his eyes caught light. By the time their drinks had gone cold, the distance between their words had shrunk. Do you ever feel, he said, leaning forward, like you've missed something? Like life happened while you were busy trying to look responsible? She gave a bitter laugh. Every day. Their eyes met, and the air shifted. Mini-climax number 3, one unusual gesture. She reached out to move his coffee cup, to clear space between them, and accidentally brushed his wrist. He didn't flinch. Instead, his fingers turned, catching hers gently. It was a stupid, impossible touch, barely there, but enough to feel like betrayal. You shouldn't, she whispered. I know. And yet you are. The clock above them ticked louder. Outside, rain hammered the glass. Inside, it felt like the world had narrowed to a breath. Major climax, her first real smile. When they finally stood to leave, she noticed he'd drawn something on a napkin, a quick sketch of her profile, eyes downcast, lines delicate but alive. He folded it and handed it to her without a word. She stared at it, stunned, then laughed, a raw, disbelieving sound that startled even her. I haven't smiled like that in years, she murmured. He shrugged, trying to hide the tremor in his hand. Guess I'm good for something after all. As he left, she caught her reflection in the rain-smeared window, her smile still lingering, fragile and dangerous. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel old. She felt seen. He found her again on a Wednesday, standing in the museum's upper gallery, arms crossed, eyes on a new exhibit. He had been planning to surprise her, though the moment he saw the professional staff badge clipped to her blouse, the idea suddenly felt like a bad one. She turned before he could decide whether to leave, and the flicker of recognition that crossed her face was half pleasure, half alarm. You can't just appear here, she said quietly, stepping closer so no one else would hear. I wanted to see the exhibit, he said, but his voice betrayed the lie. She gave him that long, measured look that could undo him faster than any touch. This isn't a cafe, Daniel. People know me here. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to. To what? She interrupted, her tone sharper now. Pretend we can bump into each other in public, like normal people. He hesitated. You sound like you regret the other night. Her eyes softened a little, and for a moment he thought she might reach for him. But instead she turned toward the nearest painting, pretending to study it. Regret isn't the word, she said. Caution is. Someone from her staff passed by, nodded politely, and walked on. They both fell silent until the sound of footsteps faded. He looked at her profile and thought she seemed older today, Not in years, but in the way she held herself, composed, untouchable, as if every movement had to be deliberate. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Not yet." They walked the gallery in uneasy quiet, stopping before a portrait of a woman sitting alone in a chair. Her expression was unreadable, her hands folded perfectly on her lap. He spoke without thinking. "She looks like she's waiting for someone who isn't coming back." "That's a little dramatic," she said, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying something she didn't want to name. He looked at her and said, "Isn't that what you've been doing?" She turned sharply, anger flashing in her eyes. "You know nothing about me." He held her gaze. "I'm trying to." That night she texted him, "You shouldn't have come." He replied, "You didn't tell me to stop." There was no answer, but a day later, she sent another message. "Tomorrow. Same cafe. Noon." When he arrived, she was already there, looking tired. She told him about her ex-husband, the divorce that had dragged for years, the friends who had quietly disappeared afterward, the son who barely texted anymore. He listened, not pretending to fix anything, only nodding when she spoke, his silence an anchor rather than an escape. At one point he said, "You talk like you're already at the end of your story." She laughed, bitter but real. "You talk like you think you can rewrite it." He smiled. "Maybe I just want to be in a chapter." The next mini-climax came quickly and without warning. A woman from her department walked into the cafe, stopped mid-step, and frowned. "Clara? I didn't expect to see you here." Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, then back to Clara. "Friend of yours?" Clara's hesitation lasted a heartbeat too long. "A student," she said finally, the word sharp enough to draw blood. Daniel felt it hit him before she did. The colleague smiled politely, said something about the upcoming board meeting, and left, but the air had already curdled. "Student," he said after a moment. "You wanted me to say boyfriend?" She shot back, her voice low but cutting. "You think that would make this easier for me?" "I think lying doesn't make it better either." "Maybe it keeps me from losing my job," she said. Neither spoke for a long time. He stared at the half-empty cup in front of him, then stood to leave. "You'll call me when you stop pretending this didn't happen," he said. She didn't stop him. For 3 days there was nothing. Then, on the 4th, she showed up outside his apartment building, coat still damp from the rain, hair pulled back too tightly. When he opened the door, she looked exhausted, almost frightened. "I got a call," she said. "From my sister. She heard something." He frowned. "What do you mean, heard something?" She said someone from the museum saw me with you and told one of the donors. "Apparently they think I'm mentoring you a little too closely." She laughed bitterly. That word again. "Student. Always safer than the truth." "Do they know who I am?" "Not yet," she said. "But if this gets back to the board, I'll have to explain myself." He stepped closer. "Explain what?" "That you were having coffee with someone who makes you smile." She closed her eyes. That would sound lovely if it didn't sound like a scandal. He wanted to reach for her, but didn't. She looked at him then, really looked, and the fight drained from her expression. "You make everything seem simple." "It's not." "I know it's not," he said softly. "But I'm still here." She stayed that night, sitting with him on the couch while the rain fell again, neither of them touching, both too aware of what they were risking. When she finally stood to leave, she said, "If anyone asks, you barely know me." He smiled faintly. "That's the first real lie you've told me." The next morning, she woke to another call, this one not from her sister, but from the museum's director. The tone was polite but pointed. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint about inappropriate conduct with a visitor. She hung up, heart pounding. By noon, she was standing outside his building again, her voice unsteady when he opened the door. "It's happening," she said. "Someone's trying to expose us." He looked at her, unsure whether to feel afraid or defiant. "Then maybe it's time we stop pretending we're a secret." Her eyes filled with something fierce, almost protective. "You have no idea what that would cost." "Maybe I don't care." "Well, I do," she said. And for the first time since they'd met, he saw genuine fear in her eyes, not of him, but of losing the life she'd built from what little had survived the last decade. That night she didn't come back, and he didn't call. They both knew the phone would ring soon enough, but not for comfort. It rang the next morning, and when she answered, a voice she hadn't heard in years said quietly, "Clara, we need to talk about this young man everyone's whispering about." The world she had built began to tilt. The call had been from her ex-husband, his voice calm, but carrying the restrained judgment she had known too well. He said he had heard from mutual friends that she was spending time with a younger man, that people were beginning to talk, that perhaps she should consider what her choices looked like from the outside. She listened without interrupting until he said, "You've always been reckless when you feel lonely." And something in her finally snapped. She told him it was none of his concern, ended the call, and sat in silence for a long time, trying to steady her breathing. When she finally texted Daniel to meet her, she didn't explain why, only said, "Tonight." No questions. He arrived at her apartment after dark. She opened the door without a word, letting him step inside. The room was dim, the city noise faint beyond the windows. He looked at her and immediately saw the tension in her posture, the way she held her arms close as if she had been bracing for a blow all day. "Who called?" he asked quietly. She poured herself a drink and said, "Someone who thinks he still has a right to tell me what kind of life is acceptable." He didn't press her, only waited until she finally sat beside him on the couch. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. After a long pause, she said, "I keep thinking about how fast this has become real. We barely know each other, and yet you're in my head all the time." He turned to her and said, "Maybe that's because it's the first thing in a long time that feels alive." She smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "You make it sound simple again." "It's not simple," he said, "but maybe that's why it matters." They stayed like that for a while, their conversation drifting between fragments of truth and half-formed plans. She told him about her job, how the museum board was increasingly political, how one rumor could turn into a formal inquiry overnight. He told her about his studies, about the professors who treated him like a promising writer one moment and a foolish dreamer the next. Their worlds were different, but the loneliness inside them felt the same. When she leaned toward him, the gesture wasn't rehearsed or careful. It happened because it had to, because the air between them had grown too heavy with things left unsaid. Their first real kiss wasn't gentle, it was hesitant and searching, an act that felt more like recognition than discovery. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "This is a mistake," and he said, "Then we'll make it again." They spent the night together, not with the reckless energy of people chasing pleasure, but with the slow attention of those who hadn't touched affection in a long time. When morning came, she woke before him and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pale light creeping across the floor. For a moment she looked at peace, but then she reached for her phone and saw 3 missed calls from her colleague, followed by a text that made her stomach turn. "Someone took a photo of you at the cafe. It's spreading around the staff group chat." She woke him gently, her voice barely steady. "Daniel, we have a problem." He sat up, confused at first, then alert when he saw her expression. She handed him the phone. He read the message and felt his pulse quicken. "Who would do that?" he asked. She shook her head. "Someone who thought it was funny, probably. But this will reach the board. They'll recognize you." He stood and started pacing. "Then maybe we tell them the truth before they twist it." She looked at him sharply. "You think that will save us? They'll call it unprofessional, unethical, inappropriate. They'll turn it into a story about power and manipulation. And even if we both say it's real, they won't believe it." He stopped pacing. "So what do we do?" "Hi, I need time to think," she said quietly. That afternoon, she went to work as if nothing had happened. People greeted her with forced smiles. In the office kitchen, she overheard 2 employees whispering, the words student and affair cutting through the hum of conversation. She walked past them without reacting, though her hands were trembling by the time she reached her desk. Her supervisor called her in for a brief meeting. The tone was friendly, but the questions were sharp. Who was the young man seen with her? How long had they known each other? Was there any conflict of interest with her position at the museum? She gave calm, measured answers, insisting that the photo had been taken out of context. When she left the office, her legs felt unsteady. She texted Daniel, "Someone knows. We need to be careful." He replied almost immediately, "Let's meet somewhere quiet. I'll find a place." That evening they met in a small bar near the river, a place with low light and no familiar faces. He told her he had already been contacted by a classmate who had seen the same photo circulating online with a caption that suggested a secret romance. His voice shook as he said, "It's everywhere now. My professor even hinted that I should stay away from you before it affects my academic standing." She stared at him, speechless for a moment, then said, "This isn't just gossip anymore. It's turning into something that can destroy both of us. He leaned forward. Then let's decide what we're fighting for. If it's not worth it, tell me now. Her eyes softened. It's worth it, she said. But that doesn't mean we can survive it. A sudden noise from the bar's entrance made her flinch. She turned and saw a familiar face. One of her coworkers, standing frozen for a moment before quickly pretending not to see them. The moment lasted only seconds, but they both knew what it meant. When they left the bar, she couldn't stop shaking. He tried to take her hand, but she pulled away, scanning the street as if expecting someone else to be watching. They'll talk, she said. They'll all talk. Then let them, he said. She looked at him, tired and frightened, but also strangely calm. You don't understand. Once this spreads, I can't undo it. My job, my reputation, even my son, he'll see this before I can explain it. He wanted to argue, to promise her that love could outweigh the damage, but the words felt thin. They walked in silence for a long time until she finally said, Go home, Daniel. Don't call me for a few days. I need to see what happens next. He didn't move. And if they find out anyway? They already have, she said. The next morning, she opened her email and saw a message from the board marked urgent. It requested her presence at a closed meeting scheduled for the following week to discuss professional conduct concerns. Her hands shook as she read it. The doorbell rang a moment later, and when she opened it, Daniel was standing there, eyes tired, holding his phone. There's something else, he said quietly. Someone recorded us leaving the bar last night. She felt the air go out of her lungs. And just like that, their secret had a witness. She barely slept that week. The email from the board replayed in her mind every hour, and she kept imagining what words they would use in that meeting, how carefully they would avoid sounding judgmental while still making her feel like a criminal. She spent long hours at her desk drafting responses that sounded professional but not defensive, deleting each one when it began to feel hollow. Daniel wanted to see her, but she told him no. It wasn't safe. She told herself it was for his protection, though part of her knew it was also because she was afraid of how much she would need him once she saw him again. On Friday, she received another message, this time from her sister, asking bluntly, Is it true? There was no greeting, no attempt at softening the blow, just those 3 words that made everything suddenly real. She didn't reply. Later that day her sister called, and though she ignored it twice, the third call forced her to answer. The first thing her sister said was, You can't possibly think this is going to end well. Clara stood by the window, gripping the phone too tightly. I don't know what you've heard, she said, but her voice trembled enough to give her away. Her sister sighed. People are talking, Clara. You're twice his age. It's reckless, and you have too much to lose. What happens when the museum fires you or your son reads about it online? Clara closed her eyes and said quietly, You don't understand. Her sister snapped. No, you're right, I don't. I just hope he's worth it. She ended the call without saying goodbye and sat down on the couch, her hands shaking. When she finally texted Daniel, it was only one line. They all know now. He arrived an hour later, uninvited but determined. She let him in without a word, and he looked around the apartment as if the air itself had changed. Tell me what happened, he said. She handed him her phone and showed him the messages, the articles circulating online with blurred photos of them leaving the bar. His name wasn't mentioned, but anyone from the university could recognize him. He read everything in silence, then said, If we tell the truth, maybe it stops looking like a scandal. She shook her head. The truth won't protect us. They'll twist it until it fits their version. He took her hand, and for a moment she let him, but then she pulled away. You don't have to get dragged into this. You still have a future that isn't ruined yet. I'm already in it, he said. You think I can just pretend none of this happened? I think you should, she said. You can still walk away before they make you their next rumor. He looked at her with something like disbelief. You're asking me to leave you. I'm asking you to survive this, she said. The silence that followed stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally he said, If I go, it won't make them stop. They'll still tear you apart. I know, she said quietly, but at least you won't have to watch. The next day was the board meeting. She dressed carefully, choosing a gray suit that made her look composed even though her heart was racing. The conference room was already full when she entered. The director greeted her with a polite nod, then motioned for her to sit. They began with vague language about public image, standards of conduct, and online perception, all delivered with the same professional courtesy that made it worse. Finally, one of the senior members said, "Ms. Holt, do you have anything you'd like to say regarding your relationship with the individual in question?" She looked around the table and saw not colleagues but judges. Her throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. "I'm aware of the rumors. The person mentioned is someone I know outside of work. He's an adult. Our relationship is personal and has no bearing on my professional responsibilities." There was a brief murmur among them, the sound of quiet disbelief. Another board member leaned forward and said, "Even if it's technically appropriate, it still raises questions about your judgment." She replied, "My judgment is not on trial here. My work should speak for itself." The director sighed. Unfortunately, perception matters as much as performance. At that moment the door opened, and everyone turned. Daniel stood there, pale but steady, holding a piece of paper. "I asked the receptionist to let me in," he said. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I need to say something." Clara froze. "Daniel, no." He continued before she could stop him. "You're all talking about her like she did something wrong, but she didn't. I'm the one who chased her. I'm the one who made this happen. If you want to blame someone, blame me." The room erupted in startled whispers. The director stood, clearly angry but struggling to remain composed. "You need to leave immediately," he said. Daniel turned to Clara. "I couldn't let them do this without hearing the truth." She stood too, her voice sharp with panic. "Daniel, please. Go." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and left without another word. The door closed behind him, leaving the room in heavy silence. One of the board members cleared her throat and said, "That certainly complicates things." Clara sat back down, her pulse pounding. "Do whatever you need to do," she said. "But don't pretend this is about ethics when it's really about judgment." They ended the meeting with a promise to review the situation and inform her of their decision. She walked out of the building with her hands trembling, aware that every person she passed might already know who she was and what she had done. When she reached the street, Daniel was waiting by the corner. He looked at her as if expecting her to be angry, but she only said, "That was reckless." "I know," he said, "but I couldn't let them talk about you like that." She exhaled slowly. "You just made it worse." "Maybe," he said, "but at least now they know it wasn't one-sided." They stood there for a long time, the city noise blurring around them. Finally she said, "They'll probably suspend me. Maybe worse." He nodded. "Then we start over somewhere else." She shook her head. "It's not that easy." That night she received an official email confirming her temporary suspension pending investigation. She read it twice, then deleted it without replying. When Daniel called, she didn't answer. Instead, she sat on the floor beside her bed, staring at her phone, waiting for the next message that would tell her what part of her life would fall apart next. At midnight, she finally picked up his call. He said quietly, "Whatever happens now, I'm not letting you face it alone." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. The silence between them was heavy but alive, and though neither spoke again before hanging up, they both knew that the story wasn't over. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. She was told not to report to the museum during that time, not to contact any staff, and not to make public statements. The email used words like procedural fairness and reputational integrity, but everyone knew what it meant. She was being measured, dissected, and judged in the quiet way institutions always judged people who made them uncomfortable. Her days lost shape quickly. She stopped checking her messages, stopped opening the curtains, and stopped answering Daniel's calls except late at night, when she could pretend the world was asleep and that their voices were the only ones that existed. When they did speak, he tried to make her laugh, asking her what she was cooking or reading, pretending they were just another couple navigating an ordinary life. She played along until the silence after each joke grew too long. One evening he said, "You sound like you're giving up." She replied, "I'm just tired." He said, "You've been fighting your whole life. Don't stop now." She didn't answer. After a pause, he said, "I'm coming over." She told him not to, but an hour later he was at her door anyway. He brought dinner in a paper bag, set it on the counter, and said, "If they take your job, you can still find another one. But if you disappear now, you'll never get any of it back." She looked at him, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "You don't understand how these people work. Once they decide you're the problem, there's no coming back." He said, "Then we stop asking them for permission." She almost smiled, but the expression faded quickly. You talk like the world is waiting to forgive us. It's not. They ate in silence. When he left later that night, he turned at the door and said, "If they fire you, tell me before they tell anyone else." She nodded, but they both knew it was a promise she might not keep. A week later, she received a letter in the mail. The board had concluded that her conduct had compromised institutional credibility and that her position was terminated effective immediately. The letter was formal, polite, and final. She read it twice, then once more just to make sure it was real. For a few minutes, she sat perfectly still, holding the paper without moving. Then she folded it and placed it on the table as if putting away something fragile. That evening, she didn't call him. Instead, she went for a walk through the quiet streets near the museum. The lights were still on inside the building, and through the glass, she could see her former colleagues arranging exhibits, moving carefully as if nothing in the world had changed. She stood there for a long time before turning away. When she finally told him the next morning, his first reaction was anger. "They can't just erase you like that," he said. "You've worked there for 15 years. She said, "They can," and they did. He started pacing. "Then we go public. You tell your side before they define it for you." She said quietly, "There's no version of this that doesn't make me look guilty." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "Then what do we do now?" "I don't know," she said. "But I think this is where it ends." He shook his head. "No, that's not what you mean." She looked away. "It has to mean something. If I keep seeing you, it just gets worse for both of us. You'll lose your degree, your reputation, your chances at anything that matters." He said, "You matter." "Not enough," she replied. The argument went in circles until she finally said, "I need to be alone for a while." He wanted to protest, but the expression on her face told him it was useless. When he left her apartment, he didn't look back. Days passed. She avoided the news, avoided calls from family, and spent her time rearranging things in her apartment that didn't need rearranging. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart jumped, but it was never him. When her son finally called, his voice was cautious. "Mom, people at school are saying things. Is it true?" She closed her eyes and said, "It's complicated." He said, "You always say that when it's bad." She didn't argue. After a long pause, he said, "I just don't want them to laugh at you." That was when she realized how much she had lost. She called Daniel 2 nights later. He answered immediately. "I was starting to think you'd disappeared," he said. She told him about the call from her son, how it had felt like being judged by the one person she thought would still see her without contempt. He listened without interrupting, then said, "You didn't deserve this." She said, "Maybe I did. Maybe I should have known better." He said, "That sounds like something they'd say, not you." He asked to see her, and she agreed. When he arrived, she looked fragile but steady, as if the exhaustion had settled into something colder. They talked for a long time about what to do next. He suggested leaving the city together, starting fresh somewhere else. She said, "You think running will make us different? The story follows us wherever we go." He said, "Then we make our own story." She didn't respond. Eventually she asked, "If you had known from the start that it would end like this, would you still have come that night to the cafe?" He said, "Yes." She nodded slowly. Then at least it meant something. He reached for her hand, and for the first time she didn't pull away. They sat quietly for a while, neither speaking, both aware that silence was the only truth left between them. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He said, "This isn't goodbye." She said, "It has to be." He shook his head. "I'll wait." She smiled faintly. "Don't." He left without another word. She closed the door, leaned against it, and stayed there until the hallway lights went out. Weeks passed, and life continued around them. She began consulting remotely for smaller galleries, trying to rebuild a version of her career that didn't depend on the approval of the people who had cast her out. He finished his degree but skipped the graduation ceremony. They didn't speak again for a long time, though sometimes one of them would type a message, stare at it, and delete it before sending. Months later, they saw each other by accident at a small public lecture on contemporary art. She was standing near the back of the room when he walked in. Their eyes met across the crowd. Neither moved, neither smiled, and neither looked away. When the lecture ended, she slipped out before he could reach her. Outside, the air was cold, and the street was quiet. She looked down at her phone and saw a new message. It was from him. It said only, "Was it worth it?" She stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back, "Ask me again in 10 years." She didn't send it. She locked the phone and kept walking. The question stayed with her long after she disappeared into the crowd, heavy and unfinished, waiting for an answer that neither of them was ready to give.